This is Fresh Tracks Weekly. This week we are talking about the overall decline of wildlife, shifting baselines, and what the biggest factors are that affect the long-term population levels of wildlife. But before we get to that, we have a bit of news. Big news for Randy in Washington, D.C. Randy, along with Congresswoman Debbie Dingell and Congressman Bruce Westerman, received Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership's award for 2024. Debbie Dingell was given the award for working hard in the conservation space for over a decade in Congress. She has fought hard for the Voluntary Public Access Improvement Act and the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, both of which would greatly benefit hunters and anglers. Bruce Westerman was given the award for work towards improving forest health, public access, and bolstering fish and wildlife habitat. He is the sponsor of the Explore Act, the Lake Act, and the America's Wildlife Habitat Conservation Act, all of which would provide significant benefits to outdoorsmen. And Randy Newberg was given the award for being a true champion of conservation and for being an advocate for the hunting community through his media platforms, including Fresh Tracks, the Hunt Talk web forum, and Hunt Talk podcast. So congrats to everyone. It's a pretty big deal. Randy and his family attended a high-end gala in D.C. and mingled with all the bigwigs of the conservation and political space to discuss important issues within the world of wildlife, habitat, and public lands. So, congrats. Also, a quick recap from last week's episode. Michael, Jace, Kara, and I went to shoot in the NRL Hunter competition in Idaho, and Kyler came along to film. It was pretty cool. We learned a lot leading up to the event, and then even more during the event, just getting better and quicker at building stable shooting positions. We competed as teams. Jace and Michael were on a team, and Kara and I were on a separate team. Kara and I got last place. Pretty sweet. So we didn't quite accomplish the goal of not getting last. That's all right. Somebody's got to be there. Jace and Michael, however, did pretty dang good. I did like the format of working together as a team. We just struggled to set up and get stable quickly. We usually timed out before we could finish shooting a stage. I think for a first time shooting in one of these competitions, I would recommend participating as an individual instead of a team. That way you get the same amount of time to shoot. Either that or you have a timer so you actually know when to switch shooters. We just kept running into the problem of the first shooter taking up most of the time, and then the second shooter would be super rushed to try to get through all the targets. Also, it's super interesting to look back at this footage and realize how many things I did wrong. I thought I had proper form in the moment. I thought I had good trigger squeezes, but can easily see in the footage, nope. Definitely did a lot of things wrong and have a lot of areas that I can improve in. All in all, super cool. I definitely feel more confident with a rifle now, but also I'm noticing plenty of things that I can improve on. We're gonna have a whole series on this coming out in August, so stay tuned for that. With that, we have a few news stories from the week. In Pennsylvania, 2 bills have been introduced that could remove the long-standing prohibition of Sunday hunting. Multiple states still have laws that prohibit hunting on Sunday in some fashion. The list has been getting shorter in the last 20 years, but several states' legislatures are still reluctant to do away with these old laws. Pennsylvania did pass a bill in 2020 which allowed one Sunday during the archery season, one Sunday in the firearm season, and one Sunday during the bear season. However, the majority of the Sundays it still remains illegal to go hunting. There has been an effort to remove all bans on Sunday hunting since then, but most of the pushback was coming from the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, supposedly because trespass laws weren't strong enough in the state. So recently the Farm Bureau has dropped its opposition to the Sunday hunting ban as long as the bill also increases penalties for trespass on private property. So that's what's happened on both Senate Bill 67 and House Bill 2106, which aim to lift the Sunday hunting ban and increase trespassing penalties. It sounds like there's optimism that one of these bills might actually pass now that the Farm Bureau has dropped its opposition. President Biden just expanded the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument by nearly 14,000 acres to protect an 11-mile-long ridgeline named Molok Luyuk. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it means Condor Ridge in the Native Patwin people's language. The land is currently and will continue to be managed by the Bureau of Land Management, but the primary change that comes from the monument status is protecting it from future development. There's been multiple applications for industrial-scale wind turbines on the ridge in the past, and this new designation will prevent those from going in. Hunting has been and will continue to be allowed on this land, which encompasses the Cache Creek and Bear Valley Tule elk hunt zones. Wildlife biologists are beginning to test the feasibility and accuracy of using drones for population surveys, in particular drones with thermal cameras that can detect animals' heat signature through various cover. The Wildlife Society Bulletin recently published a study where they tested thermal drone technology in Texas on a high-fence ranch where they had more of a controlled setting. It depends on the landscape and the species, but wildlife surveys are often conducted with airplanes or helicopters, which can be expensive and dangerous, along with being challenging in certain types of terrain with dense cover. The hope is that using these drones can can provide a safer and cheaper alternative to these methods, along with potentially increasing detection in heavy cover. In this particular study, the results of the thermal drone surveys produced an overall similar result to the helicopter, spotlight, and trail cam surveys, but they noted that in flat grassland sites, the thermal detections of wildlife were low because of solar reflectance. They also noted that populations were severely underestimated in certain thick cover due to the drone not being able to follow the contours of the hill. I found that part really interesting because consumer drones that you can buy for a couple $100 have had that technology to follow contours for the past 7 years. Anyhow, even with this limited technology in the study, they concluded that it was indeed worthwhile to use thermal drones for surveys in certain circumstances. I watched a presentation on using thermal drones to survey bighorn sheep that were hanging out in timber in northwest Montana, and it was pretty impressive how well it picked them up when they were not at all visible to the naked eye. I would venture to guess that we'll start seeing a lot more drone work and wildlife surveys in the near future. An article written by Dak Collins recently published in Outdoor Life summarized recent legislation passed by the U.S. House of Representatives that could have significant impacts to hunters and anglers. While none of the bills in question are expected to pass the Senate or to be signed by President Biden, the author noted that they send a clear message of how the mostly Republican-led bloc of legislators is likely to handle conservation-related issues moving forward. The first bill was to overturn the Bureau of Land Management's public land rule. This is the rule that was just finalized a few weeks ago that aimed to put conservation and land restoration on equal footing with other uses on BLM land like energy development, cattle grazing, and mining. The second bill aims to overturn the boundary water area protections that were put in place last year. These protections primarily accomplish placing a 20-year moratorium on mining in the area, as there has been attempts to build a copper nickel mine there recently. The previous decision to block the mine was largely applauded by sportsmen, as the boundary waters are a highly valued spot to many recreational users. The third bill aims to block lead ammo and tackle bans on federal lands. Multiple national wildlife refuges have banned lead ammo and tackle due to concerns of lead poisoning in wildlife. Sportsmen have been somewhat split on this issue, as there is significant data that lead poisoning is indeed a problem, but others argue that it's an attempt to block hunters and anglers out of these activities because non-lead alternatives are much more expensive. The fourth bill would remove Endangered Species Act protections for all gray wolves in the lower 48. All wolves were removed from the ESA in 2020, but a federal judge overturned that in 2022. As with wolves, we know that everyone will get super fired up on that on both sides. Anyway, the moral of the story is that none of these bills will likely pass right now, but that this is the direction that the majority of Republican congressmen are heading in regards to conservation issues. With that, we are jumping into our deeper dive where we're talking about range-wide wildlife declines.
What are we doing today?
Talking about wildlife declines.
Really?
And I think, to me, two of the most interesting examples are mule deer,
yeah,
and then wild turkeys.
Okay.
And I think it's interesting to look at it from multiple ways because wildlife declines is relative, right? It depends on like when declines from when.
Right.
So it's like a constant shifting baseline of what we're comparing things to. So a lot of, we think there are declines, and there certainly are with both mule deer and turkeys, but relative to when, and what are we comparing that to? Because circumstances change over time.
Yeah, I think most of them would follow a general graph of, if we say, all right, the lowest point, there's not a lot of debate, that 1900 was a really low point.
Right.
And everything kind of grew at some pace since then. And some peaked and are now on decline. Some have peaked and are kind of stable or maybe even growing slightly. So if you only want to do the human thing and say, well, history only started when I was born or when I showed up here or whatever, that can have some pretty short windows by which you're measuring things.
Right. And then you have geographic areas too. Mm-hmm. So depending on where you're at and what population you're talking about, even down to a specific drainage, there's a whole subset of factors at play. Yep. And I think we as humans like to apply an easy explanation to a complicated problem. And
yes,
so that's
we are good at that.
That's a little bit what I want to talk about. But I think it's for mule deer, there has been range-wide declines since their peak and depending on where you're at, what was it, 70s, 80s probably?
Yeah, if you look at the graphs in most states, that, again, if we start at 1900, that was kind of like when we emerged out of that dark funnel. Some states peaked in the late 50s and 60s, some in the 70s, some in the 80s, but yeah, nobody's really hit a peak in the last 20 or 30 years.
Right. But one aspect that I think I think most people know about it, but we had in the 1900s, like early to, still in some places, there's like pretty severe predator control happening.
Oh, yeah.
And for a long time, people used strychnine and what was it?
Bounties,
there was all sorts
gunning.
Of so
they did everything.
Widespread poisoning for predator control.
Yep.
And so I think in today's day and age, that's not going to happen.
Right.
And I'm kind of a fan that that's not a thing. I don't really want there to be poison across the landscape. So in certain areas, and again, you can't apply all of these things to every single area, but some of those areas, that high might be just not something that we'll never actually reach again.
Right.
Like that might be an artificial level that's unrealistic, given the circumstances we're in.
Yep.
So not only that, we'll get into habitat too, but just the poisoning thing alone is kind of a significant thing. And I don't want to downplay the fact that there are declines, because I think we should be concerned about declines, but I think it's just important to recognize all of the variables.
Some of the peaks may have been artificially high.
Right.
I think what concerns some people, and I would fall in this camp, who's older and grayer, who has watched things for a long time, is let's say there was a temporary spike because of an artificial human event, like poisoning of predators. You would hope that would reach some lower level once they stop poisoning. Predator-prey balance gets a little bit different, and it would stay kind of constant from there. So, that's kind of the way in my mind I isolate, is this one factor? Is it a multitude of factors? When some of the negative factors go away, do we ever stabilize?
Yeah.
And then if not, where do we go? Do we bounce back up? Do we go back down?
Yeah, and I think another factor that was changing at the same time is just not only human population, but human influence on the landscape.
Yes.
So
huge.
We, develop. We build houses. We build roads. We build fences. We build we have energy development. We do different practices within logging, within mineral extraction. All of these things are just little pieces chiseling off available habitat, the pressure on the deer. All of these things are impacting it, and it's very hard to quantify exactly what is causing. We know that there are certain things that will cause a detrimental, or it'll have a detrimental effect on deer, but to exactly quantify it is extremely difficult.
Extremely difficult because there's so many factors.
Yeah.
And you end up in what you just pointed out earlier of trying to solve a complicated problem with a simple solution. Yeah. And that usually isn't going to have a long-term good positive result.
Yeah. It's
to your population thing though, in preparation for this.
Yeah.
1990, the US population is 250 million. As of today, right now, it's 336 million. That's 86 million more people.
This is the U.S.
U.S. population.
Human population.
The Rocky Mountain State population, which includes Colorado, Utah, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, was 7 million.
Right.
It's now 13 million. So it's grown at a way rapid pace. It's almost doubled in that same period of time since 1990, whereas the rest of the nation were up 35%.
Yeah.
So add in all that stuff you're talking about, and the whole issue of where these numbers are and the reasons and how do you fix it really gets to be a big snowball.
Yeah. And so we had the mule deer example, and then there's a parallel example with turkeys in certain locations.
Yeah.
And this one I'm a little less familiar with because in my lifetime, my baseline, right, I've watched turkey populations expand like crazy in Montana.
Oh,
and hunting opportunity, populations, access, all of it has improved. since in my lifetime of turkey hunting.
Yep.
And so, but then back east and in the Midwest, there's a lot of places where you're seeing these declines in turkey, and a lot of people are concerned about it.
Yep.
And again, it's like those same factors, those same things we talked about: increase in population, increase in development, habitat loss. All of these things are driving turkey populations. You have a bunch of different influences from predators, and that's the thing, like predators don't have, like the influence predators have on turkeys or mule deer or whatever doesn't happen independently, right? Just the number of predators on the landscape is not strictly what determines how many turkeys or deer they're killing. It's also weather factors, and then that habitat,
quality of the habitat,
and like for turkeys in particular, nesting habitat, and like where where those nests are, what available nesting habitat they have, heavily influences how they are predated upon. So if you have less residual cover, there's this less whatever kind of nesting cover they have, that's going to affect their survival. And that's the biggest thing with birds is nest survival.
Yep.
Like it's one thing to kill adult birds, but it's really that nest survival and how many chicks are making it. That's like going to be your big influence with population. So, what I'm trying to set up for this whole thing, and we've talked about this in the past too, is we as hunters we get concerned about this stuff, right?
Yep.
And then one of the first things that I see people going to is changing hunting regulations in regards to their worry about wildlife populations.
Right. And then the second thing they go to is draw schemes, point schemes, and draw systems.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I guess the point is, we worry so much about our influence as hunters on the population, and we do have influences on the population, for sure.
Right.
But the biggest drivers are not us.
No.
We just happen to be the easiest and most convenient thing
to manipulate. Yeah.
And so we operate within those bounds, developing hunting regulations, but it's just I think in a lot of people's heads, they apply way more, I don't know, they think that it has a way bigger impact than it does. And we can't ignore it.
No, we can't ignore it, but the analogy I use is if you look at the federal government's budget, only about 80% or only about 20% of it is actually discretionary. That Congress can make a decision on. The rest is interest, debt service, Social Security, Medicare. So the big 80%. And so I kind of view that we over here in the hunting side, I doubt we're even 20%. And we think we're going to solve the big pie problem with the 20%.
Yeah.
We're not. The big pie problem is way beyond what we argue about in the hunting space. I look at this and I try to think about, okay, what's another species that maybe has done okay? In the 40 years the Elk Foundation's been around, elk numbers went from just under 600,000 and flat to declining to over 1.1 million in 40 years.
Yep.
It's like, whoa. So it can happen. We don't have to accept these declines.
Right. Yeah. In Montana, realistically, and not only in Montana, but other places in other states, we're kind of in the good old days of elk.
Yeah.
There are more elk in certain locations than there probably ever has been.
Right.
And so, it's important to look at that. And then the same with whitetail deer. Whitetail have expanded into areas that they never existed historically. And, the populations are doing quite well. And, I mean, they can fluctuate, pretty substantially, but there's a lot of places that have a ton of whitetails. Yeah. And so, I don't know. I feel like there's so much doom and gloom, and I don't want to detract. I think it's important to worry about this stuff. Yeah. But I just think the way in which we worry about it, I sometimes think is misguided.
Well, that's where I don't know how long I've been focusing on this or thinking about it this way and trying to figure out what is the solution. It's not that hunters have any less passion than they've ever had. It's not that they're any less generous than they ever were. But maybe I'm wrong in this, but I think through information and technology and communication, we focus on things like point systems. Somehow point systems are putting more elk, more mule deer, more pronghorn, more sheep, more moose out on the landscape. Look at how much energy gets diverted to that. Okay, we get into arguments about whether we should have antler point restrictions. Has that ever put another, long term, has that ever put more elk or deer or whatever on the landscape? It doesn't. And
changes age class slightly, and then
we can go on and on and on about all these things. But the history has shown that hunters, back in the day when conservation became a term, right?
Yeah.
When all the guys like Grinnell and Pinchot and all those guys came up with this concept called conservation. It's the greatest good for the greatest number over the greatest period of time. That when they introduced the notion of it with wildlife, that's what they called it. And hunters carried that ball forever. And that's a long-term investment. It doesn't show results next week, next month, next hunting season. And the pressures that hunters had at the time when they were leading weren't as intense as they are today. But I'm just all in on the productive landscape habitat side of it. I can't find my energy to argue about point schemes, to argue about seasons structures or season dates or weapon types or whatever. I get that. Those are discussions that are going to happen, and I'm not discounting that. But my mind can't pull away from the bigger picture of the quality of the habitat. And the habitat is a function of food, water, security, and space.
Yeah.
The amount of disrupted year-round, constant disruption to space that wildlife no longer has. The studies are starting to come out, and we've talked about them on this. These are things that hunters aren't going to solve at all. But we got to continue to be the leading voice and a strong voice for it. Mm-hmm. Because if not, we're going to fight about all these little things, and we're going to focus on this and focus on that. And someday we're going to wake up, and there's not going to be huntable numbers.
Yeah. I think going back to mule deer in Colorado as an example to illustrate this point. So there's been significant mule deer declines in certain spots in Colorado.
Right.
But when you look at what are the big things that have changed in Colorado while those declines have been happening,
right?
How much has the human population gone up?
Oh,
how much development has there been? Yeah. How much habitat loss, especially on winter range, has there been? How much more recreation is out, like people just like pressuring deer every time throughout the entire year?
Yeah. In 1990, did anyone have a mountain bike? Did anyone do geocaching? The list goes on and on of all these other recreational things that are going on 24/7. They're not selective or targeted towards just the male segment of the population. If you go dog walking and your dog chases a deer, it doesn't say, "Oh, that's a buck. I can chase that one." Whereas hunters, we are, in addition to being a small part of it, we also are limited. We've imposed rules and regulations to at least make our impact as beneficial as possible, or at least the least amount of detriment. The general recreation side of that, it's not controlled. It's not managed, and the appetite to manage it. I've spent quite a few in the last year. I've spent a lot of time talking to people who are the decision makers for some of these agencies, the federal agencies, and they're like, "There's no appetite for it." We understand that it's happening. There is no appetite for managing general recreation.
Yeah, no, I think we both, you and I, agree that that's one of the big things where you can make the biggest impact. But like I said, people like to focus in other realms. So one question I'm curious I have for you is, have you noticed any significant changes or seen in data somewhere, like severe declines where habitat has been like stagnant, like the amount of habitat, quality of habitat? Like I'm trying to think of like places where there is good habitat that hasn't been declining, where there also is declining mule deer populations.
I would say most everybody would agree that the habitat has been declining. If you measure these, wide landscapes for mule deer, it's been declining due to roads, highways, humans, development, subdivision, energy development, solar. So if you look at places where habitat has been somewhat protected, it's very often on private land.
Well, yeah, I can think of plenty of examples of private land as being completely plowed too that used to be native habitat.
But when you're asking for isolations of places, look at central Montana.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, people say, well, they don't have wolves and grizzly bears. Okay, they don't. And the habitat is unbelievable. And what have happened to elk numbers?
Yeah, they've exploded.
They've exploded. And then people would ask the same question, well, then what happened to mule deer numbers? Well, in a lot of the private land areas, the mule deer numbers maybe aren't doing that great on the short term because of weather or other stuff, but they're certainly not as dramatically impacted as on a lot of our public lands.
Yeah. I think that reminded me of an interesting example too, though, of there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, or people out there saying that I've seen significant deer declines in my area, and I don't doubt that. Like, I think that some people are witnessing that.
Yep.
But then when you look at the collected data from the state agencies, which I largely trust, and I know a lot of people don't, but I think that our state agencies do a pretty dang good job of collecting data. And in a lot of those places, the declines are not really happening to the level that people think they are.
Right.
Like, just because one year you went out and you saw a tenth of the deer that you saw the year before doesn't mean that there's a tenth of the deer in the spot. Like, I get it. It's frustrating. It's hard to see as a hunter, but like, I've just seen that, and then I've gone and looked up the data myself, and it's like there are fluctuations, especially year to year if you have a crazy weather pattern.
Yep.
But then when you come back 5 years after, it's like, no, they're still there. And it's just like, especially in places where the habitat has not degraded significantly, those are the places that seem to be doing well from what I've seen.
Yeah.
And so again, it's just like, I think those areas, like the habitat and habitat quality and just available habitat is so important to this puzzle. It's not like, I don't know, we just worry so much about how many deer we're killing as hunters. I don't know. It's frustrating to me. I think we're just focusing in the wrong spot.
That's my point of all this. We are focusing on the wrong spot. We've talked about this before. Northwest Montana, habitat has degraded significantly for every species there. And what has happened to the population of every species? Elk, mule deer, whitetails, down. So the one thing you mention is, people say, oh, there are fewer deer in here than there were last year. Yeah, those are short-term fluctuations. For me, I focus on what are these long-term trends.
Right.
And I don't just focus on 1 year to the next. It's like, okay, is a 30-year window worth looking at? And that's what I've been looking at, is 30-year windows. And I look at pronghorn in Wyoming, right? They grew and grew and grew. They were always pretty robust. And then in 2006, there were almost 600,000 pronghorn in Wyoming. By 2013, we're down to about 360,000 pronghorn. Like, okay, can that come back up? Is that just a short-term thing? No. Today, 18 years later, it's even lower than the 360,000. So to me, those aren't these little fluctuations that, oh, well, we had a winter kill. I get it.
Yeah.
I'm still going to complain, but they'll be back. They're not back. And the same could be said for Colorado mule deer. It follows a kind of a parabolic or a parallel to what different years and stuff, but a peak in the 90s and late 90s, early 2000s. Now we're over time, and it's just this gradual erosion.
Right.
And that's the part that bothers me, is this gradual erosion. If we continue on that trend, we can come up with whatever point scheme these damn states want to have. That's not solving this long-term trend. We can complain and throw stuff at each other about what should we do about spikes only or branch antlered or 4-point or better. That isn't changing this long-term trend. I'm with you. It's about habitat, and hunters just the time has come where the time is long past that we have to focus more and more of our effort on that. It's more expensive. It's going to be more expensive next year than it is this year.
Yep.
It doesn't show immediate returns. but it is what has got us here, and it's what's going to keep us here. If we plan on having hunting as a future activity, if we aren't all in on the habitat gig, we're just raising the surrender flag.
Yeah. No, and I think that, like, again, hunting regulations and that whole aspect, like, we should think about and worry about. But for me, it's just like, I'd rather worry about habitat and worry about, like, promoting an understanding of what's actually happening. Because, like I mentioned earlier, with the predators do have a significant play, like, in the system, especially with turkeys and stuff like that.
Yep.
Of, you know, let's understand exactly what's causing these predators to be more efficient on the landscape too. Because like you have things like ravens coming in and depredating nests, and coyotes and foxes and raccoons on turkey, you know, like all this stuff. Like, let's try to understand that and like why these predators are, you know, being more efficient. And it's often not just the fact that they're there. It's like there's a land management practice that's happening that's enabling these predators to be more efficient. It's not like people just think that, like, oh, we just need to kill all the predators. And like, okay, in certain circumstances, maybe you can have an influence. But given the tools that we have today, like, it's just not feasible. No. We're not going to put poison back across the landscape. Going and shooting 2 coyotes doesn't do anything for fawn survival. It's just like people like to apply these things. And when you look at the big picture, it's just like it doesn't really have an impact. Like, so to me, I'd rather promote and support research that's like looking into this stuff and understanding what's at play. Like, what are the land management practices in the areas that we do still have habitat that will actually.
All the species you mentioned, every study about the effects of predation on every species has said the lower the quality of the habitat, the higher the amplification of the impacts of predation. The higher the quality of habitat, the lower the amplification of what the impacts of predation are.
Yeah.
So whenever I hear people talk about predation, I don't deny it. It exists. I mean, and I hunt wolves, I hunt bears. I have no problem with that.
Right.
But we're not focusing on the right thing. If we really want to minimize the large-scale impacts of predation, we improve the habitat. That's what every piece of research has ever told us.
Yeah.
And we've taken our eye off that ball.
For sure. Yeah. And I think we just we like to simplify things, and there's so many factors at play. Like, just with predation, you have alternative prey availability. It was one that I just didn't really know too much about before I worked on some research projects. And it's like, oh, wow. As soon as the gophers not the gophers, but the ground squirrels started coming out, all of a sudden there stopped being as much predation on sage grouse. Yeah. Because it's like, oh, these are easier and better eating. Let's go eat all those instead of eating the sage grouse nests. Yeah. And so it's just like, just little things like that. Like, it's an ecosystem. Like, it functions together. So like, just because you have one thing, like, oh, you might have a grain field that supports these pheasants and whitetails, that's great. But then there's all these other wildlife species that are impacted, and it affects the whole chain. And so it's just like, it's not as simple as people like to think. So that's just the point
I love seeing people passionate about all these things, and then the debates they get into. And I don't want to see that necessarily end, but I want to make sure they're putting an equal or greater amount of their passion into the longer term investment in habitat. Yeah. And hopefully our platforms can help with that.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess that was kind of a ramble. I think
it's a really good point, Marcus. I think part of I view our job, what we do every day, is to do our best to bring focus to the things that matter and the things that the science. We always want to say science-based management. Yeah. Well, if we're really about science-based management, we should be investing billions and billions of billions into habitat, because that is what the science tells us. That will take care of a whole lot of the other things we argue about.
For sure.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, Andy.
Yeah, thank you.